we're going to get into briefly into glacial ice and how it forms and how it flows, because that's important to understand how it can carry sediment. We will look at glacier advance and retreat and what this does to our landscapes. We'll also think about glacier flow with depth. You have a little bit on your lab about that part. Then we'll think about the different landforms that are left behind by glaciers. And then look at some evidence that glaciers have been present in the past. So I have some pretty cool videos. I have some of my own photos in here too because I just had to. That first photo on the intro slide I took in 2017 in Greenland. So for our hydrologic cycle, of course, we are still going through the water cycle and how the water cycle and the different pieces of the water cycle affect our landscapes. So we covered our streams and our rivers, and here we are now up at the top of this figure thinking about the snow and the ice on Earth and how that carves and changes our landscapes. So the cryosphere. The cryosphere is what we call the part of Earth's surface that is regularly frozen. So this would be up in the North Pole and in the South Pole. So where the Earth is the coolest, where ice can survive all year long. So glaciers actually cover about 10% of Earth's surface. So it's quite a bit. In the last glacial period that we had, so where we had significant ice on Earth, the last peak in ice cover, I can say, it was about 11,000 years ago. So at that point, we had what we call the Laurentide ice sheet actually extending down into the US. So it covered all of Canada and it extended down into the US. So that was about 11,000 years ago. And right now we're still in the receding period of that ice age. So technically we are in an ice age because we do have ice on Earth all year. That is the definition of an ice age, but we're in the receding period where the ice, of course, is getting smaller. Covering less area. So there's really two types of ice on Earth. We think about ice that we have on land, and then also ice that we have in the ocean. So our ice on land being snow, ice sheets that cover an entire continent, and then glaciers. And then also we have ice in the ocean, being icebergs and sea ice. So ice in the ocean is ice floating in water. Ice on land is ice that is held up on top of a continent. So during that last glacial maximum that I was just talking about, we had a huge, you can notice, this is 2012 satellite figure of the North Pole. So 2012 was a significantly low ice year. So this is a little drastic, but you definitely get the picture. Right now we have glaciers covering Greenland, which is this right here. This is Greenland. This is Canada, and the US is down here. Here's Russia over here. If you'll notice, if you compare it to the last glacial maximum, there was a massive amount of ice covering significantly lower in latitude than what we have right now. So during this last glacial period, our sea levels were actually 120 meters lower than they are today, because all of the water that is now in the ocean was actually frozen, piled up on top of the continents. So there's only a certain amount of water on Earth. So when we have a huge amount of ice, it's like taking all of the water out of the ocean and freezing it and keeping it up in the North Pole and in the South Pole. So our sea levels were actually 120 meters lower than they are today. So our continents extended actually much further. So some different components of the cryosphere. We'll go over just a few of them. So an ice sheet is something, a large mass of ice that covers an entire continent. So that would be the largest. Ice sheets generally end in glaciers. Glaciers sometimes have an ice shelf. It's also possible to have glaciers in mountains. So mountain glaciers, let's say the Alps, if you're going to go skiing, you might see some glaciers there. And then we have sea ice, which is floating frozen ocean water. So when the ocean is actually cold enough that it freezes. And we also have icebergs, which is where a piece of the glacier and the ice shelf breaks, the ice sheet breaks off and floats away into the sea. So you don't need to know the others other than that, and we will talk about them throughout the lecture. Just a little intro. So when we think about snow, snow is probably the part of the cryosphere that you are the most familiar with, because even if you have not actually experienced it yourself, you can see it up in the mountains. If you're driving on the 405 or maybe the 55, you can get some good views. So snow has the largest spatial extent, seasonal snow anyway, of the cryosphere. So snow covers the most area, about 25% of the land in the northern hemisphere in our northern hemisphere winter. So snow plays very important roles in our environment. It's very reflective. It's very, very bright. So it can actually reflect a lot of the incoming light from the sun back out to space, keeping our surface cooler. And it's also a very, very important source of fresh water for many, many ecosystems and also people. So as it melts all throughout the spring and the summer, it feeds a lot of streams with fresh water, which are used both by us and by many, many ecosystems that depend on this source of water in the dry season, being the spring and the summer. So the snow line, when you look at the mountains and you can see the line across the mountains where above there is snow and below there is not, we call that the snow line. It's sort of the lower limit of snow. So where in height, in elevation, is it cold enough for snow to last? Above the snow line, we say that last year's snow is going to persist through the summer. So above means it's cold enough that that snow is not going to melt. Below the snow line, the winter snow is going to melt. So everything below the snow line is going to melt come summertime. So the height or the elevation of this snow line actually changes. As you can imagine, there's a few things that control whether or not we're going to have snow melt, that being temperature. So if it's very, very hot, the snow line is actually going to move up because you're going to have more melting. The other thing is snowfall. So if there is a huge amount of snowfall, it's going to take longer to actually melt. So you're going to have more snow. That snow will be able to stick around longer because there is so much snow. So your snow line might stay constant or even lower. So the next part of the cryosphere I want to go over are ice sheets. Whoops, sorry. Just real quick, there are 2 ice sheets on Earth right now, Greenland and Antarctica. This is Greenland, right here. This is Iceland here. This is Canada. This is Antarctica. Antarctica is in the South Pole. They're made up of many, 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 many glaciers. So all along the edge of this ice sheet, all of these are glaciers here, flowing from the ice sheet out to the ocean. So we're going to talk mostly about glaciers today, but where do they come from? They come from ice sheets. So glaciers are flowing ice from the ice sheet out into the ocean. So glaciers and ice sheets, how do they form? We have this huge amount of ice in both of our poles. How does this actually form? So it's very similar actually to sedimentary rock. So snow falls similarly to sediment, and it actually will accumulate in layers, just like strata. So just like our layers of rock, no, excuse me, our layers of sedimentary rock, snow falls in layers each year. So these layers eventually, over time, if they are untouched and unmelted, meaning it's cold enough for them to survive, the snow recrystallizes and actually becomes ice. So instead of layers of snowfall, after time and pressure and burial, so there's enough snow on top of it that it is under high pressure, it's actually going to become glacial ice. So it's very, very similar to the metamorphic processes. So it's sort of like sedimentary rock becoming metamorphized into metamorphic rock. We have our layers of snow that get piled up yearly, and as they get buried and buried and buried by further snowfall, they're going to be it's going to have more and more and more pressure, which will actually cause the snow to recrystallize into glacial ice. So what happens is we have we have snow falling. So here's our pretty snow crystals falling each year in layers. So over time, the snow is going to be more and more and more compressed. So first our snow falls, it's nice and light and fluffy. We have our pretty crystals. There's lots of air in between the crystals. Over time, it's going to get buried and it's going to be compressed. So snow will become closer together. It becomes compressed and the shape of the snowflake starts to disappear. So as you can see here, it's more rounded, much more compressed. As it continues becoming compressed, we actually create what we call firn. So this is when snow totally loses its snowflake shape, and it becomes more and more and more compressed to the point where it starts to look like little pebbles. This is what will recrystallize into ice. So the further we move downward, the more cemented our grains of, we can say grains, our grains of ice actually are, until we get to layers that are fully compacted into ice. So then the further you get down, you're actually going to have larger grains of ice. So we have fine-grained ice and coarse-grained ice, just like we had with rocks, fine-grained rocks and coarse-grained rocks. So it's really the same. But under these incredible pressure conditions, way down here on the bottom of this figure, we have these smaller grains of the smaller grains of ice will actually be compressed together. So the grains start to grow because the pressure is so much that the smaller grains start to physically combine. So this is something that happens very, 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 very slowly. So from 10 to thousands of years, this process. It's not something that happens over time. So again, each of these sort of layers of snow, it's going to be during the wet season or the winter season where we have snow falling. So when we think about glacier formation, you can think about what actually might cause ice to form faster or slower. So the only component is the amount of snowfall. So what can cause ice to form faster would be additional snowfall. So more snowfall. So in order to create ice, we need a cold climate. So as long as it's cold, it doesn't get up above the melting point. And we have large accumulation of snow. Because as we saw here, we need to bury these layers of snow for them to become ice, which means we need snow on top of our layer of snow to actually create ice. So we need constant accumulation of snow to continually make ice. And also no removal of snowfall, so no avalanches or wind blowing the snow away. So we also have mountain glaciers. So we did have, I was showing glaciers coming from ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, but we can't forget about mountain glaciers. They are usually much, much smaller, but they can create some beautiful mountain landscapes. So they glaciers in the mountains will flow up from the top, usually we call it an ice cap on the top of the mountain, and downward, similar to how a river would flow. However, it's much, much, much slower. So there are our mountain glaciers and then what we call our marine terminating glaciers. So this is actually the glacier that I studied in 2016. So I was camping right behind this picture for 3 weeks with this beautiful view, looking at this marine terminating glacier, which means that the glacier ends in the ocean. So the end of the glacier here, the glacier front, actually ends in the ocean. So this glacier is bringing ice from the ice sheet inland up here, downwards and out towards the ocean. So the ice is constantly flowing out towards the ocean. Then there's also land terminating glaciers. So this glacier is actually next to this one. So in where we have marine terminating glaciers, we generally also have land terminating glaciers. They might be nearby where this glacier doesn't quite make it to the ocean, so it actually just ends on land. So it ends on land here. However, there is still a good amount of melting, as you can imagine, at least in the warm season. So there's often melt lakes. So it's a little hard to see here, but there's actually a very large lake at the base of this glacier. And then streams. So streams flowing from this lake of all the meltwater out to the ocean. So glacial ice, I keep mentioning that glacial ice is flowing, but I haven't really explained that yet. So glaciers actually move under the force of their own weight. So they're incredibly heavy. If you can imagine picking up a bag of ice at the grocery store for your cooler, for your barbecue, bags of ice are relatively heavy, and they are nothing compared to the size of a glacier. So glacial ice is incredibly heavy, and it flows usually downhill because gravity is pulling that very, very, very heavy ice downward. So it flows very slowly, but it does actually flow. I have a video coming up to show you what I mean by flow. On glaciers, we generally have the zone of accumulation, which is where we are gaining mass, which means this is somewhere where it is snowing, where ice is growing, ice is accumulating, and then also ablation. So an area of ablation is where we are losing mass, where we are losing ice. So there's melt, there's breaking off of icebergs, breaking off of the ice into icebergs, which we call calving. Ablation is loss of ice. Accumulation is gain of ice. So when our glacier is advancing, this means that the zone of accumulation is greater than the zone of ablation, meaning we are gaining mass more than we are losing mass. So we have a lot of snow. Here we're not losing much, so the front of the glacier is actually going to advance. Then when we have retreat, so notice the green is where we have advance. So when we have retreat, this means that the zone of ablation is less than the zone of accumulation, greater than the zone of accumulation. So we are actually losing more mass than we are gaining, which means that the front of the glacier, which was at the red, is actually going to retreat. So when we have glacier retreating, it means that the front of the glacier is actually retreating backwards, because we are losing more mass than we are gaining. So most of our glaciers right now are retreating. So here I can show you what I mean by glaciers flowing. So this is time-lapse imagery put into a movie to show how the glacier moves. So it's sped up, of course. This is a couple of days worth of pictures. But we see that the glacier is actually flowing downhill, like really, really, really sticky honey. So that is really the best way to show how glaciers flow, is to actually show you rather than to try to explain it all. So I have a couple more videos, 2 more. So glaciers are always flowing downhill. As you saw, they're incredibly heavy. They're always flowing downhill. How are our glaciers actually disappearing? This is due to a couple of things. Surface melt, which is just melt on the surface of the ice from the sun. Basal melt, which is melt of the glacier along the bottom. So as the bottom of the glacier moves against the surface of the bedrock, the rock beneath, that can cause friction, which can cause melting. There's also melt from the ocean. So those marine terminating glaciers that end in the ocean is generally warmer than the ice because the ocean is not frozen. It's incredibly cold, don't go swimming there, but it's warmer than the ice. So that heat from the ocean actually has a huge effect on those marine terminating glaciers, causing extra melting. And then the other aspect is calving. So calving is when you have pieces of the iceberg, pieces of the glacier actually falling off and breaking from the front of the glacier. Usually this happens a lot in marine terminating glaciers, so they float away as icebergs. So I have a video here. This is from a documentary called Chasing Ice, which is now it is available free on Netflix. I highly suggest watching it because it is so cool. So if you're interested at all in glaciers and ice sheets, if you want to see just some incredible footage, I highly suggest watching Chasing Ice. I watch it all the time, I'm not gonna lie. So this is the largest ever recorded calving event. So there are huge calving events all the time. But this was really, really monumental in that it was recorded on video.
Adam, it's starting.
This is in Greenland, by the way.
This is the big piece is starting to calve. Let me call you back. Call him back. Okay, bye.
So this is very, very zoomed in. This ice, right there, you can see it moving. It's breaking off from the glacier.
Holy shit, look at that big bird rolling.
Sorry for the slow.
All 4 running, right? Yeah. Look at that. You see how, look at the whole thing.
So this is the glacier here. All that ice just broke off and is now floating away in the water. This is the ocean here up against the glacier. It's just filled with other pieces of floating ice. So here you can see the ocean splashing up against the glacier.
calving faces 300, sometimes 400 feet tall. Pieces of ice were shooting up out of the ocean 600 feet and then falling.
Oops.
The only way that you can really try to put it into scale with human reference is if you imagine Manhattan. And all of a sudden, all of those buildings just start to rumble and quake and peel off and just fall over and roll around. This whole massive city just breaking apart in front of your eyes. We're just observers, these two little dots on the side of the mountain. And we watched and recorded the largest witness calving event ever caught on tape.
So how big was this calving event that we just looked at? We'll resort to some illustrations again to give you a sense of scale. It's as if the entire lower tip of Manhattan broke off, except that the thickness, the height of it, is equivalent to buildings that are 2.5 or 3 times higher than they are. That's a magical, miraculous, horrible, scary thing. I don't know that anybody's really seen the miracle and horror of that. It took 100 years for it to retreat 8 miles from 1900 to 2000. From 2000 to 2010, it retreated 9 miles. So in 10 years, it retreated more than it had in the previous 100.
Yep, so I highly suggest watching that documentary, one of my favorites. I study calving events for my PhD, so as you can imagine, pretty awesome for me to see that footage. Highly suggest watching it. It is on Netflix, called Chasing Ice. So at the end, he was talking about the retreat of the glacier. That glacier that we just looked at is the fastest flowing glacier in Greenland. So all of these things, even though our glaciers are flowing downhill, we are losing mass. The glaciers are retreating. So this is a much shorter video. I want to show you what I mean then by retreat. Even though the glacier is flowing downhill constantly, the front of the glacier actually moves. So I apologize that this video is in Spanish, but you can guess what the months are. There's no speaking, so it's okay. So you'll notice the glacier is flowing downhill. However, the position of the ice front changes, even though the glacier is flowing downhill the entire time. And narrow is January. So that is showing how the glacier can be flowing downhill, but actually still losing mass, meaning that the glacier front will still retreat. So those, of course, are linked if you want to watch them again. So ice flows by what we call driving stress. So the stress that actually causes the ice to move downstream. And that stress, or the amount of force, depends on the thickness of the ice. So how much ice do you have? If there's a lot of ice, it's going to push the ice downstream even faster. And then also the slope of the bedrock. So how steep is the mountain that your ice is flowing down? If it's extra steep, then the ice is going to flow faster. If it's rather flat, the ice isn't going to flow as much. It's similar to rivers and streams. So ice motion is a combination of sliding and deformation. So basal sliding, meaning basal is just along the base. So when the glacier actually slides along the bedrock, so this creates some pretty cool striations on the rock, which I'll show you some photos of at the end of the lecture. Basal sliding is where you have the ice just sliding down the slope. And then internal deformation is where we actually have different layers of ice moving at different rates. So it sort of ends up looking like this. So the crystals inside the ice sort of rearrange themselves into parallel layers because there's so much pressure. They actually get really condensed into these parallel layers, and they start to glide on top of each other. So large amounts of pressure actually cause the ice to slide against each other. So we end up deforming the ice, so it doesn't stay as a perfectly straight column. You actually have layers of ice sliding against each other. So there's two different types of flow, which will be important for you to know. There is plastic flow and brittle flow, or rigid flow. So plastic flow is where the ice is under so much pressure, so this is at depth, that the ice actually moves like a plastic. So it flows like a plastic, so it doesn't move in a straight line. This is where we have the internal deformation causing plastic flow. So it's more malleable. You can think of it like the flow of the mantle. Brittle flow is where the ice is not under extreme pressure, so it actually moves very rigidly downslope. So the rigid zone or the brittle zone is where you have brittle motion. The ice just moves rigidly downslope. It's sort of just along for the ride. So motion of the glacier is fastest at the surface and in the middle. So it's the same as when we talked about speed in a stream. So away from the friction of the edges of the glacier where the ice is slowed down by the bedrock, both on the bottom and on the sides. So the fastest part of the ice will be on the surface and in the center of the glacier. So here we show basal sliding, which is where the ice, so let's say we drilled a hole here. What's going to happen to that hollow hole? Well, actually it would close up, but what's going to happen to that hole? Let's say we put a pipe down there over time. There would be some basal sliding, so every part of this ice is just going to slide downhill, slipping along the bottom of the ice. Then there will also be plastic flow. So under, you'll see this dotted line is telling us there's the brittle zone on top and the plastic zone on the bottom. So the plastic zone on the bottom is going to cause plastic flow, which means it's going to bend. It's malleable. It's not going to move rigidly. The brittle zone on top, we have that part of the drill hole is completely straight. So there was no plastic movement in the brittle zone. It is still perfectly parallel to how it was drilled. So on the brittle zone, due to brittle deformation, we have cracking. So the ice, you can imagine, it's brittle, it cracks. So as it is moving, it cracks when it goes up over a hill or when it goes down over a hill, when it hits a little bump in the bedrock. We call these crevasses. So they can be incredibly large when they are When they're close to the ice front, when there's a lot of cracking, these crevasses can be very, very, very dangerous if you're working on the glacier. So here's a picture of, not me, not anyone that I know. I found this one on the internet. I do have some friends that do this type of work. I do not. They are very, very secure. They're doing, hopefully all of this very safely, but you can imagine you wouldn't want to fall down here into this crevasse. So what happens as ice moves is it can very smoothly move up over a hill. So the glacier flows up over this nice hill, and then as it falls down the hill, it actually removes a lot of sediment, a lot of pieces of the bedrock. We call it plucking. It sort of plucks up a lot of the bedrock here as it falls down on the other side of this mountain. So the glacier is going to smooth out one side of this hill that it goes over. It's going to smooth it out, and then it's going to pluck on the downstream side. So as the glacier then can go down this hill, it's going to pluck apart, make a very steep slope here on this side. So when looking at a previously glaciated landscape, you can actually tell the direction that the ice flowed by looking at the orientation of hills and mountains. So generally they're hills if a glacier has already existed there. So you'll notice that all of the hills in the area have one very smooth side and then one very steep, messy looking side because the glacier flowed, smoothed out one side and then plucked all the way down on the other side. So the next piece to talk about is sea ice. So we'll just quickly talk about sea ice, which is frozen ocean water. So this is the North Pole, this is the sea ice here, or with Greenland here, and then there is sea ice extending all around the continent of Antarctica. So sea ice forms when the ocean is actually cold enough to freeze. It doesn't happen everywhere, of course. This is only in very extreme cold. Some areas have seasonal sea ice, so sea ice forms every winter and then it disappears. So you'll notice here, this is the March extent at the end of the winter season, and then the September extent at the end of the summer season. So you can see how it changes seasonally. And then there's also perennial ice. So this ice here actually exists all year round. Both around Antarctica and in the North Pole, we have both the permanent ice and the seasonal ice. So sea ice on Earth, it's very important for a lot of large scale processes on Earth. So it affects ocean circulation. So it changes the salinity. By freezing water, you are removing water, but you keep the same amount of salt in your ocean. So you actually make the ocean saltier. It also affects the reflectivity of the surface of the Earth, which is called albedo. How does Earth absorb heat coming in from the ocean, or does it reflect it back out to space? It also affects how heat and also gases exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. And of course, it provides a very unique habitat for animals and organisms that rely on it. So I took these pictures in 2017 in May, up in the sea ice. I did a project on the sea ice in May up north of Svalbard, which is part of Norway. So here's a polar bear mama and the baby. We were a very safe distance away. This picture was very, very zoomed in. We were also on a boat, a very, very large boat, so we were safe there. But polar bears are amazing. Never, ever, ever get too close. The last part of ocean ice is icebergs. So maybe you've seen a movie about a famous iceberg called the Titanic. We actually believe that that iceberg broke off of the same glacier that we watched the calving event from. So Chasing Ice, that documentary I was talking about, we believe that that glacier, which is called Jakobshavn-Isbrae, we believe that the iceberg that sunk the Titanic actually came from that glacier. So icebergs are floating blocks of calved ice. So when calved ice breaks off the glacier, it becomes an iceberg when it floats away. So here's a joke, of course, about glacial erosion. So glacial erosion is incredibly powerful. Glaciers can cut through almost anything, and they can carry a huge amount of sediment and also boulders. So glaciers can pick up and move pieces of rock that water could never move. So if you had to guess which of these was before versus after glaciation, you will learn throughout this lecture that this picture here is the after photo. So here we have some nice V-shaped valleys. We have our mountain, we have our river streams. Here we have our U-shaped valleys and our horns and our hanging walls. We're going to get to all of those. But here is what the glaciation would look like. So we have our glaciers. These are all mountain glaciers here, coming in and totally carving out our landscape to the point where the after photo, once all of that ice melts, would leave the landscape looking something like this. So to name some of these features, you're going to have to do this a little bit in your lab. U-shaped valleys. So remember we talked about rivers creating V-shaped valleys? Glaciers create U-shaped valleys. There's also a cirque, which is sort of a circular bowl caused by a glacier. Arête, which is a ridge line caused by two glaciers. A horn, where multiple glaciers meet. I have real pictures of these coming up too, more than just this cartoon, so you can see them. And then a hanging valley is where two glaciers intersect, but at different elevations. So it causes a waterfall. So you can see them here. This glacier was up higher, and then it flowed into this much larger glacier, which actually caused what we call this hanging wall. Naturally, it looks like a hanging wall. And the water that flows down will then be a really pretty waterfall. So here we have the U-shaped trough. So the U-shaped valley. So this would be the profile that was carved by a river. That V shape that we talked about when we talked about streams. A glacier would have caused this very U shape. So that is one way to tell if your valley was carved by river or glacier. Is it sharp and pointy like a V, or is it wide and broad like a U? So this might look familiar if you've ever been up north. So here we have our wonderful Yosemite Valley here. And if you notice, it is a very U-shaped valley. That's because this was carved by a glacier. So here we have a picture of a hanging valley, or a hanging wall, where we have the stream coming and then there's sort of a jump down. There's a really nice waterfall there. Here is a horn, where we had multiple streams of glacier coming together, creating this point. Kind of looks like a horn. And then here's some more pictures. So our arête, which is a ridgeline caused by glaciers, so in between flowing glaciers. You can notice them here. And then a cirque is sort of where a bowl forms and creates kind of a circular glacier. So you can see these cirques here. Cirque, most of these words are French words. Cirque means circle. So a fjord is what we call a U-shaped valley that has then been flooded by the ocean. So marine terminating glaciers always end in a fjord because they end in the ocean. So a fjord is just the ocean that has since flooded these U-shaped valleys that were carved by glaciers. So here is Western Greenland. All of these figures that I'm using are just from my study sites. So I studied these glaciers right here. This is the glacier that we watched the video of, the fastest flowing one, where we think the iceberg came from that sunk the Titanic. So you'll notice there are these fjords which are filled with water. So this is the fjord I'm studying right now. These are all U-shaped valleys from when the ice extended out further, carving these U-shaped valleys. Now that the ice has retreated, these U-shaped valleys have now filled in. So all along these glaciers, we have these very intricate fjord systems leading up to the glaciers, all carved by when the glaciers were extended or when the glaciers had advanced out to further distances. So glacial striations, this is what I was talking about when I was talking about basal sliding. So this is when the glacier is actually sliding against the bedrock. Now that the glacier is gone, we can actually see these very, very, very cool marks that were caused by the glacier sliding. So they're generally all parallel to the direction of the flow, and it can cover very large distances. It's literally just scratches in the rock caused by the glacier ice as the ice was flowing over this rock. So glaciers sort of act like a conveyor belt. So these are from the textbook, these images. I thought it was such a great way to explain glacier deposition. So it really acts like a conveyor belt for all of the rock and the sediment, and even pieces of the bedrock that maybe fall on top of the glacier or are picked up from below. So all of the sediment, because that glacier is always flowing downstream, that sediment is also going to be carried and flowed downstream. So any dust, any dirt, any rock that falls on top of the glacier, as well as any loose pieces of rock that get picked up as the glacier is moving along, it's all going to end up in what we call a moraine. So that will be all the way at the end of the glacier, at what we call the toe of the glacier. It's going to end up in this large pile of unconsolidated rock and sediment. So it's not compacted. It's really like a pile. It's really just accumulated of non-compacted, non-cemented material. So that we would call a moraine at the end of the glacier. So some more depositional landforms. So you can see these, this is what we just talked about, where we have these piles of sediment that are carried downstream. We can also have them on the edge of the glacier. So on the edge of the glacier, sometimes, usually, rock and sediment can also be deposited along the edge of the glacier, where the glacier is moving slower. You can have accumulation of rock and debris there as well. So here is an actual picture of what that might look like. So where you have these brown stripes, that's just dirt and sediment and rock being carried by this ice. So you'll notice this brown stripe here is all of the sediment from the edge of this glacier here, combining with the edge of this glacier here, where they meet. So it's going to carry all this sediment all the way down the glacier, and you can often see these dark black lines all the way down parallel to the ice flow. It's quite cool. So here you'll notice there's a lot of debris. This is sort of at the edge of the glacier where it's moving a little bit slower, where maybe you're having a lot of this rock material falling on top of the glacier. All of this sediment is going to flow downstream with the ice. So we can have very, very, very distinct landscapes from caused by glacial deposition. So the glacial sediments. So the way that glaciers move sediment, the way that glaciers deposit sediment, and then when glaciers disappear, what does that look like afterwards? you're going to see those moraines, those piles of sediment there. You can also see different lakes and different streams that were caused by the glacier melting. So one type of rock, actually, that we consider the only glacial type of rock is called glacial till. So it's not really a rock type, it's more like a feature. So it's called glacial till because this is the sort of completely unsorted mess of sediment deposited by a glacier. So what's very unique about this is it's always located either underneath a glacier, at the toe of the glacier, at the very front of the glacier, or along the sides. And this glacial till can have absolutely massive boulders because glacier ice is going to carry everything with it. So it's so strong and heavy that it will actually pick up huge boulders and move giant boulders hundreds of miles. Whereas even the strongest flood might not be able to pick up a rock of that size. So where you have huge boulders in the same space or same area, same layer as very, very small sediment, you know that this must be glacial till. This must have been moved by a glacier. There's no water source that would have been able to move such a large rock at the same time as very, very tiny sediment. So a glacier moves all the sediment all at once, deposits all the sediment at the toe of the glacier or along the sides of the glacier all at once. So there's no sorting, there's no turbulent mixing, anything like that, which we see in the rivers and streams. So we really see just a complete mix of huge boulders and tiny, tiny grains. So glacial till is pretty interesting. Glaciers form very, very cool landscapes. So as I mentioned, I think at the very beginning, the last peak of ice cover that we had on Earth, we call, it was about 11,000 years ago, and we had the Laurentide ice sheet extending into the US. So the Laurentide ice sheet actually created a lot of what we see today. So you'll notice there was a very, very strong river of outwash flowing from the glacier down towards the Gulf of Mexico, which you might recognize now as where the Mississippi River is. So that was actually carved by the outwash and the meltwater from the Laurentide ice sheet moving down towards the ocean. Also, up in New England, if anyone's ever been, great place. I grew up around here. So the terminal moraine of the Laurentide ice sheet actually shaped a lot of the funny shapes that we have in New England. So Long Island, this strange shaped island that sticks out here from New York, was actually formed by this moraine. The same with the islands in Massachusetts and Cape Cod here, this funny shape, was actually formed by all of that glacial sediment. So this is where the end of that conveyor belt was. And the glacier, that ice sheet, just poured sediment here over and over and over for many, many years, to the point that it actually built up to be higher than sea level. So it actually added all of this land. So these islands, Cape Cod and Long Island, were actually formed by the glacial conveyor belt.